You know, they call him the Oracle of Omaha. For a reason, right? But what if I told you that some of the biggest, most colossal financial blunders in history were made by this exact same guy, Warren Buffett? So today, we're going to dig into the monumental billion-dollar mistakes of a living legend. And more importantly, figure out what we can all learn from them. All right, so let me ask you, what do you think was Warren Buffett's single greatest mistake? It's a really fascinating question because, and this is the crazy part, the very foundation of his entire empire, the name you see everywhere, Berkshire Hathaway, is actually a monument to this huge error. And this wasn't an era of math or spreadsheets. Nope. This one was born from pure petty anger. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're going back to 1964. A young, kind of hotshot investor named Warren Buffett starts buying up shares in this failing textile company up in New England. The name? Berkshire Hathaway. Now, his plan was super simple. Just a quick stock flip. Buy low, sell a little higher, make a quick buck. The business itself? It was a total dog, but he saw an easy win.
So the company's CEO at the time, a guy named Seabury Stoughton, he calls up Buffett. He makes a verbal offer to buy back all of Buffett's shares for $11.50 apiece. Buffett's like, great, done deal, a handshake agreement, right? But then the official letter shows up in the mail, and the offer isn't for $11.50, it's for $11.37.50. Staunton tried to chisel him, to save a measly 12.5 cents a share. I mean, can you believe the nerve?
Oh, Buffett was absolutely livid. This wasn't about the money. It was about the disrespect. So what does a guy like Buffett do when he gets mad? He doesn't just walk away and complain. No. Out of sheer, raw spite, he starts buying up more stock, and then more and more, until he has a controlling stake in the entire company. And you know what his very first move was as the new boss? You guessed it. He fired Seabury Stanton on the spot. Okay, so revenge might feel sweet for a minute, but that victory was totally hollow. Why? Because Buffett was now the proud owner of a terrible, dying textile business. He ended up spending the next 20 years pouring good money after bad, just trying to keep this sinking ship afloat. And get this, he later crunched the numbers and figured out that if he'd just taken a deep breath and invested all that money in the insurance business from the get-go, instead of letting his anger get the best of him, he'd be about $200 billion richer today. $200 billion. And you know, Buffett himself is brutally honest about this whole thing. He flat out calls it, quote, the dumbest stock I ever bought. And yet, think about it, that name is still on the door of his multi-hundred billion dollar empire today. It's like a permanent reminder of a very, very expensive grudge.
All right, let's move on to the next major blunder. Now, if that first one was a mistake of pure emotion, this next one was a mistake of structure. And honestly, it might just be one of the most expensive financial errors in all of history. And it all started with what looked like a fantastic shoe company.
So back in 1993, Buffett goes out and buys Dexter Shoe for $433 million. And on the surface, it looked like a classic Buffett deal. A great American brand, a solid competitive advantage, the whole shebang. But here's the fatal flaw, the one tiny detail that changed everything. He didn't pay with cash, he paid with his own company's stock. 25,203 shares of Berkshire Hathaway to be exact. And that was a catastrophic mistake.
What happened next was just brutal. Almost immediately after the ink was dry on the deal, Dexter Shoe's competitive advantage completely vanished. You know, cheap imports flooded the market, and the company just couldn't compete. Its value cratered. It went down to basically zero. The entire $433 million investment, poof, wiped out, gone. But that's not even the real tragedy here. The real pain wasn't losing the shoe company, it was the mind-boggling value of the Berkshire Hathaway stock he handed over. Those 25,203 shares he traded away, today they're worth more than $15 billion. He literally traded a pile of diamonds for a worthless pair of flip-flops. You know, sometimes the biggest mistake isn't what you buy, it's what you fail to sell. It's about inaction. And that brings us to our third story, Tesco, the huge British supermarket chain. This is all about the incredibly high cost of just hesitating, when all the warning signs are flashing bright red. So, Buffett was a huge investor in Tesco, but then the cracks started to show. First, you get profit warnings from management. Okay, not great. Then you see they're really struggling, losing ground to all the new discount stores. And then, the final nail in the coffin, a massive accounting scandal breaks. Turns out they'd been cooking the books and overstating their profits. I mean, the red flags weren't just there, they were on fire. And Buffett knew it. He knew he should get the heck out. But he didn't. He just waited. He later admitted to what he called thumb-sucking, basically just sitting on his hands. And while he was thumb-sucking, the stock just went into a free fall. That hesitation, that inaction, cost him $444 million. He was just too slow on the trigger when the news turned bad.
This experience gave us one of his greatest quotes, and it's a perfect illustration of the lesson he learned. He wrote, "In the world of business, bad news often surfaces serially. You see a cockroach in your kitchen, as the days go by, you meet his relatives." Basically, his advice is, when you see that first cockroach, get out of the house. Don't stick around to meet his aunts, uncles, and cousins.
Okay, so far we've talked about the money he actively lost through bad decisions. But what about the absolute fortunes he just missed? Buffett calls these his sins of omission, and you could argue these are his biggest failures of all. We're talking about the multi-trillion-dollar boats he literally watched sail right on by.
Let's start with Google. Get this, his own insurance company, Geico, was one of Google's earliest and biggest customers. He was literally signing the checks for a fortune in advertising every month. He saw their power. He understood their monopoly on search, but he did nothing. Why? Because tech was outside his so-called circle of competence. And then you've got Amazon. He openly admired Jeff Bezos, thought he was a genius, but he stayed on the sidelines because he said what Bezos was doing was a miracle, and he doesn't invest in miracles. He was just too rigid, and he missed two of the greatest wealth creation machines in human history.
All right, our next one is a real head-scratcher. It's about a mistake so bad, he made it twice. This is the painful story of Buffett's on-again, off-again love affair with the airline industry, and it's a brutal lesson in why you should never forget your own history. Okay, so back in 1989, he invested in US Air. It was a complete disaster. He lost a ton of money. He got so burned that he basically swore off the entire industry forever. But then, fast forward to 2016, he shocks everyone and jumps right back in, pouring billions into the major US airlines. He claimed the industry had finally changed, that it was different this time. Well, 4 years later, the pandemic hits. And what does he do? He sells his entire airline portfolio right at the bottom of the market, locking in billions of dollars in losses. Ouch.
And here's the kicker, the really ironic part. After that first disaster with US Air, he had this famous quote where he joked that if a capitalist had been a Kitty Hawk back in 1903, he should have shot Orville Wright to save future investors from the money pit that is the airline industry. It turns out his first instinct, his gut feeling from decades ago, was absolutely spot on.
So, okay, we've gone through all these massive failures. Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? Because it reveals something absolutely crucial. Even the Oracle of Omaha is human. He loses billions because of a grudge, he makes bad deals, he forgets his own lessons. So the real question is, how on earth is he still one of the greatest investors of all time?
Well, if you look closely, his mistakes weren't really about bad math or complex financial models. They came from very, very human flaws. They were emotional, right? Like the pure anger that led to the Berkshire deal. They were structural, like how he paid for Dexter Shoe with that incredibly valuable stock. They were behavioral, like just hesitating and thumb-sucking on Tesco. And they were ideological, like being too rigid in his thinking to buy Google. See, the real secret to his success isn't that he's perfect. It's not that he doesn't make mistakes. It's all about what he does after he messes up. His method is simple. Acknowledge, analyze, and move on. First, he owns it. He publicly acknowledges his mistakes, often in hilarious detail in his annual letters to shareholders. Then, he analyzes exactly what went wrong so that he, and everyone reading, can learn the lesson. And then, and this is the most important part, he moves on.
This really gets to his core philosophy. He absolutely does not let his past failures paralyze him. He learns the lesson from what's in the rearview mirror, but he keeps his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, because he knows that dwelling on yesterday's blunder is the fastest way to miss tomorrow's big opportunity.
So at the end of the day, the question isn't if you're going to make a mistake. You will. I will. We all do. The real question is, what happens next? What's your next move? Are you going to try to bury it and pretend it never happened? Or are you going to study it, learn from it, and use that knowledge to make sure that your next move is your best move yet?